I just thought I'd impart a little history that I've kind of gathered myself. It's very interesting. Um, so here it is. This is a little history lesson from the base Commodore, a based history lesson. Okay, so this is why the Jewish people seem to be in control of this country, the United States. Back many years ago, like 100 years ago, um, there was a potato famine in Ireland, and so they all came over here in droves, all at once, to seek asylum, and because they were starving in Ireland, and there was this big, beautiful Statue of Liberty welcoming them at Ellis Island in New York on the ship when they came over, and so that's where they settled in New York, the first place they landed, and but see, the Italians had beaten them. The Italians got here first, but they got here because they saw opportunity, and so the rich Italians were already in place as an Italian as a mafia, the Italian mafia before that happened, and so the Irish needed a place in this new society because they didn't want to be harassed by the Italians. So they became police officers, and that's why most of the police in America, in New York, are Irish. In Britain, the Scottish became the police. That's why they got their own little place in downtown London called well, I forget what they call it, but yeah, they were given land in in Ireland, in London. But I'm getting off track. So here in America, uh, the Irish came over and they became the police. And so then later, the Jews, which had been kicked out of every other country in northern Europe, because what they would do is they would come. First of all, they started out as the Egyptian people. The people lived in Egypt, and then after Egypt fell, they came over. They split the Red Sea, and they came over here. Um, they what do you call it when everybody moves at once? Exodus. They exodus to northern Europe or to Italy, and they became the Romans. And they were very smart people, and they weren't good fighters. They weren't very strong people. They couldn't physically beat the Northern European Celtics. The Celtics would just they they were self sufficient, and they had these towers everywhere, but they weren't a cohesive nation. They were just roaming bands of nomadic bands of white men, but they were like Vikings, and they were good at fighting, and they learned the secret of how to make steel, and so they could easily cut through these Roman ranks. In fact, they would eat mushrooms and go into berserker rage and just cut through the phalanx and just destroy their front line of defense, and just um, charge these Romans, and the Romans would circle the Celtic villages for years and build an entire camp around the village and not let anybody in or out, thinking they could starve them out. But they wouldn't starve because they were self sufficient. They had everything they needed within their boundaries. And they would also have these towers, like the rook in chess, just these little cylinder towers where they would uh, sit on top with bow and arrows and just take out. And they couldn't burn them out, they couldn't get them out. And every once in a while, if they surrounded a village for too long, another roaming band of Celtic warriors would come along and fight them off and get rid of them and push them back to Rome. In fact, there was one instance where the Celtics actually came into Rome and kicked everybody's fucking ass and killed their leader, and then they withdrew. So they were very scared of the Northern European Celtics, and they created a new religion. They sat around and figured out, let's take them over with religion. So Rome, the Vatican, was the headquarters for all this, and they used stuff they learned from Cleopatra. They went to Egypt to find out, and there you go. There's another Jew from Egypt, and they used all that knowledge to create a new religion, and they wrote the Testament, the Bible, and then the New Testament, and they kept trying to push these characters like Jesus and stuff that were made out of different characters, and the whole story and everything he did was derived from the allegories of the Northern Celtics that created the zodiac and all the celestial constellations, and these stories where they anthropomorphized the constellations and gave them stories that they could teach their children. And so all these stories came from everything in the Bible, and everything in Christianity was an amalgamation of Egyptian and Celtic stories. And so they sent out saints to all throughout Northern Europe. Like, let's take, for example, Ireland. They sent St. Patrick to Ireland, and the Celtics in Ireland at the time were worshiping Crom, like in Conan, because all that was written from Sumerian history. The oldest recorded history we have from like 5000 BC. These people were worshiping Crom, and they would, give blood sac. I don't know if they gave blood sac. They would give, if they had too much, if they made too much food, they would sacrifice it and leave it to the altar, and so they had an altar for Crom, and Saint Patrick came with a hammer and destroyed their altar. And I'm sure he had a few thugs with him to make sure no locals stopped him, and he had like a little following, and they used the rubble. He got people from around the area and to use the rubble to build a new church. And then they brought in the bell. They always bring in their bell that they can ring to get people to come. And they started teaching a new religion about a one true God, because there was the Norse people had many different gods, and they were all based on Odin or Woden, or even the Romans themselves before that copied all the Northern European mythology and just reappropriated it and changed the names into Roman. And so basically Roman mythology is just a rehash, like when they redo a movie, and they stole everything, they plagiarized everything, and it was all just a rehash of the Norse mythology. And so they did the same thing with Christianity, but they changed it up a lot, and they took all these anthropomorphized stories of the constellations and put them into characters. Jesus travels around with 12 disciples, just like there's a video called Zeitgeist, and the first chapter is called Religion, the Greatest Story Ever Told. And it breaks down in great detail how they did that, how they created the Catholic religion. It's great. You got to watch that. Very good documentary done by somebody who they made the music and everything. It's just wonderful. I watch it over and over just because it's beautiful. It's the way he did it. Zeitgeist, the movie. So, yeah. So these Jewish people, oh, and then Rome fell. Okay, and then they went into all these castles that they had built all over Northern Europe, and they because they understood that you can't fight an enemy if you don't know who he is or where he is, and so they divided up all this Northern Europe into different countries, and they created different languages for each country. That's why they're all based on Latin, because they spoke Latin in Rome, and German and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and French and English. It's all based on Latin. Even everything's the same mathematically, the same math and everything, the same characters. And that's why they don't. That's why Russia and China never really signed on to any of that. They already had their own language, and it was totally different, and it was not based on Latin. So all these countries in Northern Europe were now divided. So because their part of their trick was not only to disappear, but to divide and conquer their enemy, divide them and let them fight amongst each other. And they did that. They created castles all over this place, and it became feudalism. And they all seemed to be fighting each other. They got everybody to fight each other, and the church was nestled inside of each castle, and they used the governments, the kings, the royalty, to fight each other. And then once all that was settled on who was the toughest and everything like that, they started the Dark Ages, where they wouldn't let anybody learn anything, and they destroyed their culture and everything and called them pagans. Celtics were no longer Celtics; they were pagans, because they didn't believe in the one true religion. So then they went around and stole all the technology and culture from every country they could find with the Crusades. They created these Knights Templars, and they would go around and kill everybody and steal their technology and bring it back to the Vatican. And that's where it's all stored, in their library now, underneath the Vatican in the basement. And then once they did that, on Friday the 13th, and this is why it's bad luck, on Friday the 13th, because they stabbed all the Templars in the back and killed them because they were too powerful. They just needed them to go do their job, and then that's what they do. They create powerful people, they give them power, and then once their use is over with, they kill them and get rid of them, because they don't want them to become a problem later. They did, however, because they did not kill them all, and they all became Freemasons. And even though there was this ban on books and stuff, and it was the Dark Ages, and they went underground and saved all this architecture. That's why they were called Masons, because they would come along and they could build Romanesque architecture. And that today is what they used to build the United States of America. Much later on, they came over here because the Freemasons survived, and they started using that Romanesque architecture all over the country, wherever they weren't kicked off by Native Americans. Like in Taos, New Mexico, they weren't allowed to do it there. The Native Americans cut all their heads off, and Anyway, and they also used gunslingers. The gunslingers would come in first and kill off any badass or anybody with the gun. And but like I said, in Taos, they didn't put up with gunslingers either. They cut their heads off too. Taos is a badass place. Taos, Taos, New Mexico. It's the only place where they never got their foothold in because of these crazy badass motherfuckers. And you won't read about that in any history books. It's a big secret. Anyway, getting off track. So the Freemason. Oh, and then they created the Inquisition, where if you did not say that you believe in Christianity, they'd torture you until you did or died. So that's how these. Okay, and so that was all pushed by the proto Jew. And so later on, these people, and that's why they look a little less ferocious than the average Aryan. They're still afraid of Aryans, and they're not Aryans. They're this. They come from the same. We all come from the same monkey gene or whatever, but they were living for thousands of years in togas, having slaves do their bidding, and they control the world with an iron fist, and they were very together, and they had armies with beautiful armor, and just they were very flashy, and that turned into Britain, and Britain went around and did the same thing. They all these people became powerful oligarchs, and they ruled the world in their little secret aristocracy, which they still do. But there was still hordes of Jewish people that weren't part of the aristocracy, and they were kicked out of every country because they looked different. They were uglier, they had the big hooked nose and short little fat bodies, and they were just not sexy at all. But somehow they always stuck together, and they knew exactly how to take down a government financially. They'd go into the right institutions. They got into banking, and they got into lending, which actually became against the law. It was called usury, and it was punishable by death to loan somebody money and then get money, interest back on that. And then they would get into the medical industry here and later on, because they know that when somebody's about to die, no matter how rich they are, they'll spend all their money just to live a few more days, or to be taken care of in the final time of their life. So that's how you get a nation's money, is you take it from each individual at the end of their life, and you make their life shorter. So you get into food processing, create the cancer industry, and kill people. So make sure they don't live past 60 and they get cancer, so that you can put them in a hospital and take all their money. COVID was perfect, but it was like a short investment idea for them. Anyway, still getting off track. Okay, so the Jews also, when they came over here, remember when I was talking about how the Irish flocked over here? Well, after that, the Jews flocked over here because of they were starting to get kicked out of every country, and this was back, before World War I and II, but especially in the 40s, after World War II, they got kicked out. They all got pushed into this little country in northern Sweden or South Germany, in the mountains, in the Alps, because they became a roaming band of gypsies, a huge roaming band, and they made their money by entertaining people like gypsies do. They come to your town, they entertain you, they sell you elixirs, and then they leave. And so there was this huge group of people there still living in Europe, the roaming band of Jews, and then they came over here, and they became lawyers, because there was already this in the social structure of New York. There was already the Italian mafia, the Irish police, and so where would the Jews naturally fit into this puzzle? In as lawyers, right? They became the lawyers, and that's why to this day most New York lawyers are Jewish families, and all over really. So they didn't really like being lawyers. Okay, they couldn't bring all those people to this country that were, hiding in northern Europe, or in its cold mountains of Europe, pushed into this little area where nobody wants to live, this arid land. They couldn't bring them over as lawyers because that's a small industry, and you just can't have. Some of these people weren't that intelligent to be a lawyer. It was just not feasible. So four of the richest Jews, went over across the country to California, to this little bitty town called Hollywood that had nothing, no infrastructure whatsoever. And they built all the utility companies and houses, and they built a whole city ready. And they brought over all those people all the Jews that were in Northern Europe, in that little town, all the gypsies, and they brought them over, and they changed their names, and they became actors. And they started the four major studios. So just a group of Jews started this whole thing, and they were having such a sway on American politics and the way people think, that they were even taken before Congress and told that they could not do certain things, that they were to work for the American propaganda. And they did. They started making propaganda films, and to this day they are in charge of the propaganda and the psyop that keeps Americans in line. So that's changing now because of the internet. They don't want that. They don't like people like Aryans talking to each other on the internet. That scares the shit out of them. That's why American patriots are considered terrorists. That makes no sense. Who are we going to terrorize? Ourselves? This is our country, right? Everything they do doesn't make any sense at all. But so they're not behind it all. There's still an American deep state that controls them and tells them what to do, and has agents in Hollywood making sure all the psyops run properly, and everybody's MK Ultra'd and vetted and everything. You can't just have anybody come along and get famous, and that's why people get whacked. And that's why it's a dog-eat-dog industry. So that's why Hollywood is Jewish, and it's not just Jewish people. It's a small group of people who are related and that sleep together. And, they're very tight. That's the only way you can get into that crowd, and that's why all these people, all these Jews that came over here in the 40s, that was the perfect time to come to America and start investing all that money they had saved up. Because they got into all the real estate and they own everything. And that's why wherever you go, wherever the real estate is nice, like Florida on the beachfront, or California, or New York, all these places that have the most expensive real estate, the reason why they're all Jewish is because these Jews got in here and had all the money and bought it all up, and they won't sell it. And that's why all the rich people, the boomers, okay, they're the boomers, and they bred like rabbits here in America. And so now all these people that you see that are rich, they're all Jewish. They're all fat, ugly people. Like they think they don't know how to be happy. Most of them are brainwashed by their own people. Anyway, that's it for now. That's today's history lesson. Peace out.